Hi, I'm Emma. I thought family gatherings meant acceptance, belonging, a place where you could finally exhale and be yourself. Instead, at our annual reunion, my own mother handed me a paper plate through a car window and told me I wasn't dressed appropriately for the dining room. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 28 years old, and I was eating potato salad alone in a Honda Civic while my family enjoyed prime rib inside Riverside Country Club. But what happened next changed everything. Sometimes the people who should lift you up are the ones holding you down, and sometimes a stranger sees your worth when your own blood refuses to. The morning of the Thompson family reunion dawned crisp and clear, one of those perfect Connecticut September days where the leaves were just beginning to hint at autumn's arrival. I stood in my small Hartford apartment, staring at the contents of my closet like they held the answers to questions I wasn't brave enough to ask. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks ago, embossed with gold lettering that screamed tradition and old money. Annual Thompson family gathering, Riverside Country Club, Millbrook. Cocktails at 4, dinner at 6. Dress code, country club appropriate. That phrase had haunted me for weeks. Country club appropriate. What did that even mean for someone like me? Someone who worked 60-hour weeks at a marketing firm downtown, whose idea of fine dining was the Thai place that stayed open past midnight, whose most expensive dress came from a department store sale rack 3 years ago. I pulled out a navy blue wrap dress, the kind I wore to client presentations. It was conservative, professional, clean. It would have to be enough. My phone buzzed against the dresser. A text from Claire, my roommate and the closest thing I had to a sister who actually cared about me. You don't have to go, you know. We could binge watch reality TV and order pizza instead. Much better company. I smiled despite the knot forming in my stomach. Claire had been my anchor for the past 3 years, ever since I'd moved to Hartford and started trying to build a life. That made sense to me, even if it didn't make sense to my family. But I had to go. Not because I wanted to, but because absence would be noticed, discussed, dissected. The Thompsons were masters of turning missing family members into cautionary tales about ingratitude and poor character. I'd learned that lesson the hard way when I'd skipped Christmas 2 years ago to work on a campaign that eventually landed me a promotion. The phone calls had lasted for months. The drive to Millbrook took exactly 43 minutes, a journey I'd made countless times, growing up, but one that felt increasingly foreign each year. The town hadn't changed much since I was a teenager desperate to escape it. Pristine colonial houses sat behind perfectly manicured lawns, their driveways filled with luxury cars that cost more than I made in a year. Everything looked like a magazine spread titled How the Other Half Lives, which was ironic considering I'd grown up here, in this world of careful appearances and unspoken rules I'd never quite mastered. Riverside Country Club perched on a hill overlooking the Connecticut River, its white columns and red brick facade designed to intimidate as much as impress. The circular driveway was already crowded with Mercedes, BMWs, and Range Rovers. I pulled my 5-year-old Honda Civic behind a gleaming Porsche and immediately felt like an imposter. The valet, a young man probably not much older than me, approached with a polite smile that faltered slightly when he saw my car. I handed him the keys, anyway, straightening my shoulders as I walked toward the entrance. The country club's lobby was exactly as I remembered it. All dark wood, Persian rugs, and the kind of hushed atmosphere that made you want to whisper. Oil paintings of stern-faced men in hunting attire lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow you with disapproval. Crystal chandeliers cast everything in a warm, golden glow that should have felt welcoming but instead felt exclusionary, like you needed a membership card just to breathe the air. I could hear the Thompson clan before I saw them. Their voices carried that particular blend of privilege and entitlement that had been bred into them over generations. They were gathered in the Oak Room, a private dining space reserved for special occasions and people who could afford to make every day feel special. Through the French doors, I could see the familiar figures that made up my extended family. Uncle David stood near the fireplace, gesturing animatedly with a tumbler of whiskey. Cousin Sarah laughed too loudly at something her husband whispered in her ear. And there, holding court in the center of it all, was my mother. Patricia Thompson was 62 years old and had spent every one of those years perfecting the art of making others feel small. She stood with the posture of someone who'd attended finishing school, her silver hair styled in a way that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her navy St. John suit was accessorized with pearls that had been her mother's, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was the kind of woman who could deliver a devastating insult while appearing to pay you a compliment, and she'd made that particular skill into an art form. I took a deep breath and pushed through the French doors. The conversation didn't stop exactly, but it shifted, the way conversations do when someone unexpected enters a room. My mother's gaze found me immediately, her smile tightening almost imperceptibly. I'd learned to read those micro-expressions years ago, the way you learn to read storm clouds when you live in tornado country. "Emma," she said, her voice carrying across the room like a bell. "How nice that you could make it. I wasn't sure. You'd be able to get away from work." The emphasis on the last word was subtle, but unmistakable. Work was what people did when they couldn't afford not to, and according to my mother, it was something that shouldn't interfere with family obligations. I walked over and kissed her cheek, inhaling the familiar scent of Chanel No. 5 and disappointment. "Of course I'd be here," I said. "I wouldn't miss it." The lie came easily after years of practice. My father, Richard, appeared at my mother's, elbow with the ghost of a smile that told me he was already 3 drinks deep. He'd always been the softer of my parents, the one who might slip me $20 when my mother wasn't looking, or defend my decision to major in communications, instead of something more practical. But his support came in whispers and shadows, never strong enough to stand up to my mother's hurricane-force personality. "There's our city girl," he said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like bourbon and aftershave. "How's the apartment? Still sharing it with what's-her-name?" "Claire," I supplied. "And yes, we're still roommates. It works out well for both of us." I didn't mention that Claire was the reason I could afford the apartment at all, or that she'd become more family to me than most of the people in this room. My sister Jessica chose that moment to glide over, her husband Brian trailing behind her like a well-dressed shadow. Jessica was 2 years older than me and had spent those extra years perfecting the art of being everything my mother wanted in a daughter. She'd married well to a man whose family owned a chain of luxury car dealerships. She lived in a colonial house with a circular driveway and spent her days organizing charity luncheons and tennis lessons. She was, in every way that mattered to my mother, a success. "Emma!" Jessica's voice held that particular tone of surprise that suggested she'd forgotten I existed until this very moment. "You look nice. Very professional." She glanced at my dress with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for tax audits. "Is that new?" "New to me," I said with a smile that felt more like a grimace. I'd learned not to lie about money to Jessica. She had a talent for sniffing out financial details and using them as weapons later. Brian nodded at me politely, but didn't speak. He never quite knew what to do with me, this sister-in-law who worked for a living and didn't seem particularly interested in finding a husband to support her. In his world, women like me were anomalies to be observed from a safe distance. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. They talked about vacation plans and home renovations, private school admissions, and country club politics. I nodded at appropriate intervals and made the right sounds, but I felt like an anthropologist studying a tribe I'd once belonged to but could no longer understand. My youngest brother Michael arrived fashionably late, fresh from his first year at a prestigious law firm in Boston. At 26, he was the golden child, the one who'd chosen a respectable career and was dating a woman from an even more respectable family. He swept into the room like he owned it, accepting congratulations and backpats with the easy grace of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. Emma! He actually seemed genuinely happy to see me, which was more than I could say for the rest of them. How's the marketing world treating you? Still trying to convince people to buy things they don't need? His tone was teasing, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there when we were kids. Something like that, I replied. How's corporate? Law? Still trying to help rich people stay rich? He laughed, but I could see my mother's disapproving frown from the corner of my eye. Apparently, criticizing law was different from criticizing marketing. One was a noble profession, the other was just a job. As the cocktail hour continued, I found myself gravitating toward the edges of conversations, never quite central to any of them. I listened to Jessica complain about her housekeeper's scheduling conflicts, and Uncle David pontificate about the declining quality of the club's golf course. I watched my cousins share photos of their children's private school accomplishments and their latest home improvement projects. I was present but not included, acknowledged but not embraced. It was my cousin Margaret who finally said what everyone was thinking. Margaret was one of those women who'd never worked a day in her life, but somehow felt qualified to judge everyone else's choices. She'd married her college boyfriend the day after graduation and had been living off his trust fund ever since. "Emma," she said, her voice carrying the kind of false sweetness that always preceded a verbal knife thrust. "I have to ask, and please don't take this the wrong way, but are you planning to settle down anytime soon? I mean, you're almost 30, and it just seems like you're wasting your best years on this career phase." The room didn't exactly fall silent, but I could feel the attention shift in my direction. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for, the chance to dissect my life choices and find them wanting. "I'm 28, I corrected, keeping my voice level. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And I'm not in a phase. I have a career that I enjoy and that pays my bills. I don't see that as something I need to settle down from." Margaret's laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh, honey, that's exactly what someone in denial would say. I'm sure your parents worry about you, living in that little apartment, working all those hours. When I was your age, I was already planning my second baby. There's something to be said for having priorities." I felt my chest tighten, that familiar sensation of being judged and found lacking by people who'd never had to worry about paying their own rent. But before I could respond, my mother appeared at my side with the kind of timing that suggested she'd been hovering nearby, waiting for exactly this moment. "Well," she said, her voice carrying across the group, "we all have different paths in life. Some of us are builders, and some of us are explorers." The pause before explorers was loaded with meaning. In my mother's vocabulary, explorers were people who were lost. The dinner bell saved me from having to respond, its rich bronze tone echoing through the club like a call to battle. We began the migration toward the main dining room, a procession of Thompsons dressed in their country club finest. I fell into step behind my parents, trying to ignore the way my dress suddenly felt too simple, too cheap, too wrong for this place. The dining room was exactly what you'd expect from a country club that had been serving Connecticut's elite for over a century. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables set with bone china and sterling silver. Oil paintings of long dead. Members gazed down from the walls with the kind of stern disapproval that suggested they were still judging the current membership. Fresh flowers adorned each table, their perfume mixing with the scent of money and tradition. But as we approached our reserved tables, I noticed my mother pause. She turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between regret and determination. Emma, dear, she said, her voice lower than usual. I'm afraid there's been a small issue with the seating arrangements. It seems they've overbooked our reservation, and there's not quite enough space for everyone at the main tables. I looked past her at the 2 round tables that had been set for our party. I could see place cards at each seat, elegant cream cardstock with names, written in careful calligraphy. I counted quickly. 22 seats for what should have been 23 people. Someone was going to be left out, and we all knew who. I'm sure we can work something out, I said, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. My mother's smile was the kind she used when delivering bad news she'd carefully packaged as a favor. Actually, I've already spoken to the staff. They've prepared a lovely plate for you to take outside. You know how much you enjoy eating al fresco, and the weather is absolutely perfect today. You can sit in the garden or even in your car if you prefer somewhere more private. The words hit me like a physical blow. She was asking me to leave, not just the dining room, but the entire reunion. She was handing me a takeout container and suggesting I eat alone in my car like some kind of unwelcome delivery driver. I looked around at my family, waiting for someone to object, to suggest we could squeeze in another chair or ask the staff to expand the reservation. But I was met with averted eyes and uncomfortable silence. Jessica studied her manicure with sudden intensity. Michael found something fascinating about the chandelier above his head. Uncle David appeared to be deeply invested in a conversation with his wife about absolutely nothing. My father cleared his throat softly. Maybe it would be easier, sweetheart. You know how your mother worries about these things, and you've always been adaptable. Adaptable. That was the word they used when they meant disposable. I stood there for a moment that felt like an hour, surrounded by people who shared my DNA but had never truly shared my life. I could feel the attention of other diners, could sense the whispered conversations and sideways glances. The Thompson family drama was playing out in real time, and I was the star of a show I'd never auditioned for. Of course, I heard myself say. That sounds fine. My mother's relief was palpable. She reached out and squeezed my arm with a touch that was meant to be comforting, but felt more like a dismissal. You're such a good sport, Emma. I knew you'd understand. I'll have them prepare you something special. Wow. Within minutes, a server appeared with a white takeout container and a plastic cup of water. The container was the kind used for leftover wedding cake, not the sort of thing you'd expect at a country club that charged $200 for a dinner reservation. The entire transaction felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else. I accepted the container with as much dignity as I could muster, which wasn't much. The walk through the dining room toward the exit felt endless. Every step was a reminder that I didn't belong here, that I'd never belonged here, that all my attempts to bridge the gap between who I was and who they wanted me to be had been futile. The country club's parking lot was nearly empty, most of the guests having already settled into their evening plans. I found my Honda Civic wedged between a Bentley and a Tesla, looking like exactly what it was: the poor relation at a rich family's gathering. The valet had left my keys on the dashboard, a small courtesy that somehow made everything worse. I sat in the driver's seat and opened the takeout container. Inside was a piece of salmon that looked like it had been scraped from someone else's plate, a small portion of rice pilaf, and some steamed vegetables that had already started to wilt. This was what my family thought I was worth: leftovers in a doggy bag. The worst part wasn't the humiliation, though that burned like acid in my chest. The worst part was the realization that I'd seen this coming and had shown up anyway. I'd dressed carefully, driven 43 minutes, and walked into that club knowing that they would find a way to make me feel small. I'd participated in my own diminishment. I took a bite of the salmon and forced myself to chew. It tasted like shame and resignation, seasoned with the salt of tears I refused to let fall. Through the dining room windows, I could see my family, settling into their seats, already deep in animated conversation. They'd moved on from my absence as easily as they'd orchestrated it. As I sat there in my car, eating reheated fish and questioning every life choice that had led me to this moment, I had no idea that my story was about to take a turn that would change everything. Sometimes the lowest points in our lives are actually the launching pads for our greatest transformations. Sometimes being pushed out of one door is exactly what we need to walk through another. The evening air was beginning to cool, and I could hear the distant sounds of laughter and conversation drifting from the club. My family was inside, enjoying their perfectly prepared meals and their perfectly curated conversations. And I was outside, eating leftovers in a parking lot, trying to figure out how I'd let my life become this small. But as I would soon learn, sometimes the people who matter most are the ones you meet when you're at your lowest. Sometimes being excluded from one table leads you to exactly where you need to be. And sometimes the validation you've been searching for your entire life comes from the most unexpected source of all. I was halfway through forcing down another bite of lukewarm salmon when I heard footsteps approaching across the gravel. My first instinct was to duck down in the seat, hoping whoever it was would pass by without noticing the woman eating dinner alone in her car, like some kind of social pariah. But the footsteps stopped right beside my driver's side window. A gentle tap on the glass made me look up, and I found myself staring at a distinguished older gentleman I didn't recognize. He was probably in his early 60s, with silver hair that looked professionally styled and a navy blazer that screamed old money. Everything about him suggested he belonged here in a way I clearly didn't. I rolled down my window reluctantly, preparing for another round of polite humiliation. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the kind of refined accent that comes from generations of private school education. "I'm William Harrison, president of Riverside Country Club. I couldn't help but notice you dining out here, and I wanted to make sure everything was all right." I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. Of course, the club president had noticed me eating takeout in the parking lot. This was probably some kind of violation of their standards, another way I'd managed to embarrass my family without even trying. "Oh yes, everything's fine," I stammered, setting down my plastic fork. "I'm just with the Thompson party inside. There was a small seating issue, so I thought I'd enjoy the fresh air." Even as I said it, I knew how pathetic it sounded. "William," Harrison's expression shifted subtly, his eyebrows drawing together in what looked like concern. "A seating issue? I'm sorry, but I'm not following. We confirmed the reservation for 23 guests just this afternoon. Has there been some kind of mistake with our arrangements?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications. I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. I could lie, make some excuse about preferring to eat outside, but something in his manner suggested he already knew that wasn't the truth. "No mistake," I said quietly. "Just family dynamics. You know how it is." But William Harrison's frown deepened. "Actually, I don't think I do. Miss Thompson, isn't it? I make it my business to know our members and their families. Your parents have been hosting this reunion here for over 15 years, and I've never known there to be any seating complications. We pride ourselves on attention to detail." The way he said my name caught me off guard. He knew who I was, which meant he'd been paying attention to our family's arrangements for years. But more than that, he seemed genuinely concerned about the situation, not just protecting the club's reputation. "It's not the club's fault," I said quickly. "Really, this is just how things worked out tonight." "May I ask you something?" William said, his voice gentler now. "How long have you been eating dinner alone in parking lots at family gatherings?" The question hit me like a physical blow because it forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding. This wasn't the first time. There had been graduations where I'd been seated at the children's table despite being an adult. Holiday dinners, where I'd been asked to eat in the kitchen so there would be more room for the adults. Birthday parties where my invitation had come with conditions and qualifications. "I don't usually eat in parking lots," I said. attempting humor that fell flat even to my own ears. "But you do usually find yourself excluded from the main table," William observed. It wasn't really a question. I looked down at my hands, still holding the plastic container of congealing fish. How had my life become so small that this felt normal? When had I started accepting crumbs as if they were a feast? "Mr. Harrison, I appreciate your concern, but this really isn't your problem. My family has their ways of doing things, and I've learned to adapt." Adapt. He repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "Miss Thompson, in my 40 years of experience in hospitality, I've learned that adaptation often looks a lot like accommodation. And accommodation can become a habit that serves everyone except the person doing the accommodating." There was something in his tone that made me look up at him again. His expression had shifted from polite concern to something that looked almost like recognition, as if he'd seen this scenario play out before. "I don't want to cause any trouble," I said. "What if I told you that the trouble has already been caused, and it wasn't caused by you?" Before I could respond, he straightened up and adjusted his blazer. "Miss Thompson, I'd like to invite you to join me for dinner. Not as a consolation prize or an act of charity, but because I have a feeling. There's a story here that deserves to be heard." I stared at him, certain I'd misunderstood. "I'm sorry, what?" "The club has a private dining room that I use for special occasions. It's quieter than the main room, and the view of the river is spectacular at sunset. I was planning to dine alone tonight anyway, and I'd welcome the company." "I couldn't possibly," I started, but he held up a hand. "Before you decline, let me tell you something. I've been watching the Thompson family dynamics for 15 years. I've seen how seating arrangements mysteriously change, how certain family members find themselves with different meal times or alternative arrangements. I've watched it happen, and I've said nothing because I believed it wasn't my place to interfere in family matters. But tonight, watching you eat reheated salmon in a parking lot while your family enjoys prime rib inside, I realize I've been wrong." His words hit me with the force of validation I'd been craving my entire life. Someone had noticed. Someone had seen the pattern of exclusion and recognized it for what it was. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you care?" William Harrison was quiet for a moment, looking out across the parking lot toward the river beyond. "Because 30 years ago, I was sitting in a parking lot eating cold chicken from a takeout container, while my ex-wife's family celebrated our daughter's graduation inside a restaurant I couldn't afford. I told myself it was temporary, that I was adapting, that this was just how things were. It took me far too long to realize that some adaptations aren't healthy. The revelation hung between us like a bridge I hadn't known I needed. Here was someone who understood, someone who'd walked a similar path and emerged on the other side. "What changed?" I asked. I stopped waiting for other people to make room for me and started making my own room. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate, but it was necessary. He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen all evening. "Now, will you join me for dinner? The salmon in the private dining room is considerably better than what you're currently attempting to consume." I looked down at the soggy fish in my lap, then back up at this stranger who seemed to see me more clearly than my own family ever had. "Okay," I said, "but I should probably let my parents know where I'm going." "Actually," William said carefully, "I was thinking we might handle this a bit differently. Why don't you leave that with me?" There was something in his tone that suggested he had a plan, something more than just a polite dinner invitation. But after an evening of being made to feel invisible, the prospect of being seen felt revolutionary. I gathered my purse and stepped out of the car, leaving the takeout container on the passenger seat like evidence of a crime I was finally ready to stop committing against myself. William Harrison offered me his arm with old-fashioned courtesy, and together we walked back toward the club. But instead of heading toward the main entrance, he guided me around the side of the building to a smaller door marked Private Members Only. He produced a key card from his jacket pocket and led me into a hallway I'd never seen before. One lined with photographs of club presidents and championship golf tournaments dating back decades. "The founder's dining room," he explained, as we approached a set of mahogany doors at the end of the hall. "Reserved for special occasions and distinguished guests." The room that greeted us was like stepping into a different world. Where the main dining room was grand and imposing, this space was intimate and warm. A single table was set for two, near floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Connecticut River. The table itself was a work of art, set with china that looked like it belonged in a museum and crystal that caught the light from the chandelier above. "This is incredible," I breathed, momentarily forgetting my embarrassment in the face of such understated elegance. "It should be," William said with a chuckle. "The membership fees help maintain it. Please, have a seat." As I settled into a chair that probably cost more than my monthly salary, William signaled to a server who appeared as if by magic. "Thomas will have the chef's selection tonight, with the wine pairing if Miss Thompson approves." I nodded, still trying to process the surreal turn my evening had taken. An hour ago, I was eating leftovers in a parking lot, and now I was dining in a room that felt like it should require a security clearance to enter. "Mr. Harrison," I started, but he waved a hand. "William, please. And before you ask again why I'm doing this, let me explain something about this club. Riverside was founded in 1923 by a group of men who believed in excellence, tradition, and most importantly, recognizing quality regardless of its packaging. Over the years, we've strayed from some of those founding principles, but I've been working to restore them." Thomas appeared with the first course, a delicate soup that smelled like heaven and tasted even better. As we ate, William told me about the club's history, about members who'd made significant contributions to the community, about the scholarship programs and charitable initiatives most people never heard about. "But you didn't invite me here to discuss club history," I said as Thomas cleared our soup bowls. "No," William agreed. "I invited you here because I have a proposition for you." The word proposition made me stiffen slightly. I'd learned to be wary of men in positions of power who made propositions to younger women, especially when those women were in vulnerable positions. William must have noticed my reaction because he smiled reassuringly. "Not that kind of proposition. A professional one. Tell me about your work, Emma. What do you do in Hartford?" I found myself describing my job at the marketing firm, the campaigns I'd worked on, the clients I'd managed. As I talked, I realized how passionate I sounded, how much I genuinely loved the creative problem-solving aspect of marketing. It had been so long since anyone had asked me about my work with genuine interest that I'd almost forgotten how fulfilling it could be. "Impressive," William said when I finished. "Particularly the campaign you developed for the nonprofit healthcare network. That kind of social impact marketing is exactly what we need more of." "Thank you," I said, surprised by how much his praise meant to me. "Emma, I'm going to share something with you that I haven't discussed publicly yet. Riverside Country Club is at a crossroads. We can continue to be an insular institution that serves the same families it's always served, or we can evolve into something more dynamic, more representative of the community we exist in." The main course arrived, and it was everything the a parking lot salmon hadn't been. Perfectly prepared, beautifully presented, accompanied by vegetables that actually had flavor and personality. "I've been authorized by the board to hire a marketing director," William continued. "Someone who can help us rebrand, reach new demographics, develop community partnerships. Someone who understands both the value of tradition and the necessity of progress." I nearly choked on my wine. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you an opportunity. The position comes with a substantial salary increase from what you're currently making, full benefits, and most importantly, the freedom to implement your vision for what a modern country club can be." My mind raced. This felt too good to be true, too convenient, too much like a fairy tale resolution to a very real problem. "William, I appreciate this more than you know, but I can't help feeling like this is some kind of pity offer because of what happened tonight. He set down his fork and looked at me seriously. Emma, I've been researching marketing professionals in the Hartford area for 3 months. Your name came up repeatedly in my conversations with colleagues. Your portfolio speaks for itself, and your references are glowing. I've been trying to figure out how to approach you for weeks. Really? Really? The fact that you happen to be Patricia Thompson's daughter is coincidental. The fact that Patricia Thompson clearly doesn't recognize your value is unfortunate, but not relevant to your qualifications. As we continued dinner, William outlined the position in detail. It was everything I'd dreamed of professionally, and some things I hadn't dared to dream of. The salary alone would allow me to move out of Claire's apartment and into my own place. The work would be challenging, creative, and socially meaningful. There's one more thing, William said as dessert arrived. The position comes with certain perquisites: health insurance, retirement matching, and membership privileges here at the club. Membership privileges? Full social membership, access to all facilities, dining privileges, guest privileges, and voting rights in club governance. I stared at him. You're telling me I could become a member of the club that my family has to scrimp and save to afford for special occasions? Not just a member. Given the nature of your position, you'd be designated as a key employee member, which actually carries more privileges than standard membership. The irony wasn't lost on me. My family, who'd just banished me to eat in the parking lot, would suddenly find themselves in the position of requesting privileges from the club where I worked and held membership. I need time to think about this, I said, though every fiber of my being was screaming yes. Of course, take all the time you need. But Emma, can I give you one piece of advice? I nodded. Don't let other people's inability to see your worth determine your own sense of value. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's success. As we finished dinner, I felt something shifting inside me, some fundamental alteration in how I saw myself and my possibilities. For years, I'd been trying to earn a place at tables where I wasn't wanted. Maybe it was time to build my own table. Thomas appeared with coffee and petit fours, and William raised his cup in a toast. To new beginnings, he said. To new beginnings, I echoed, and for the first time in years, I actually believed they were possible. As we sat in that beautiful room overlooking the river, the sun setting in brilliant oranges and purples beyond the windows, I realized that sometimes the end of one story is actually the beginning of another. Sometimes being pushed out of your comfort zone is exactly what you need to discover you were capable of flying all along. The evening that had started with humiliation was ending with possibility, and I had a feeling that this was just the beginning of a transformation that would change everything. The drive back to Hartford that night felt different from every other trip I'd made between Millbrook and the city. My hands gripped the steering wheel with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years, and for the first time in recent memory, I wasn't replaying family conversations in my head, analyzing every slight and cataloging every disappointment. Instead, I was thinking about William Harrison's offer, about the possibility of a life where my professional skills were valued and my personal worth wasn't constantly questioned. I pulled into the parking space outside my apartment building just after 11, my mind still spinning with the evening's unexpected turn. The building was quiet, most of the windows dark except for the blue glow of televisions and the occasional reading lamp. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to the apartment I shared with Claire, fumbling with my keys in the hallway light that flickered intermittently and had needed replacing for months. Claire was curled up on the couch in her pajamas, a bowl of popcorn balanced on her knees, and a romantic comedy paused on the television screen. She looked up as I entered, her expression immediately shifting from casual interest to concern when she saw my face. "Okay, spill," she said, muting the television and setting aside her snack. You left here looking like you were headed to your own execution, and you're coming back looking like you've seen a ghost. What happened at the family circus?" I kicked off my heels and sank into the armchair across from her, suddenly exhausted by the emotional whiplash of the evening. "It was worse than usual, and then it was better than I could have imagined, and now I don't know what to think about anything." Claire tucked her legs under her and leaned forward with the kind of attention that reminded me why she was the best friend I'd ever had. "Start from the beginning." So I told her everything, about arriving at the club and feeling immediately out of place, about the conversation with my cousin Margaret and my mother's orchestrated seating arrangement crisis. I described sitting in my car with the takeout container, feeling like I'd hit some kind of rock bottom in the ongoing saga of my family relationships. "They made you eat in your car?" Claire's voice rose with indignation. "Emma, that's not family dynamics. That's emotional abuse." I'd never thought of it in those terms before, but hearing the words spoken aloud made something click into place. It was abuse, systematic and calculated, designed to make me feel grateful for scraps while they enjoyed the feast. Then I told her about William Harrison, about his unexpected appearance in the parking lot and the dinner invitation that had followed. Claire's eyes widened as I described the private dining room and the conversation that had unfolded over wine and perfectly prepared salmon. "He offered you a job?" Claire sat up straighter, her excitement palpable. "Emma, that's incredible. What kind of salary are we talking about?" I named the figure William had mentioned, and Claire nearly choked on her popcorn. "Are you kidding me? That's almost double what you're making now. You could afford your own place, you could save money, you could actually have a life outside of work and family obligations." "I know," I said, though the reality still felt surreal. "But Claire, what if this is just some kind of elaborate pity gesture? What if he felt sorry for me and created this opportunity out of guilt?" Claire gave me the look she reserved for when I was being particularly dense about my own worth. "Emma, do you hear yourself right now? You're literally talking yourself out of a dream job because you can't believe someone might actually recognize your talent." She wasn't wrong. I'd spent so many years having my abilities questioned and my contributions minimized that the idea of someone actively seeking out my professional skills felt impossible to accept. "Besides," Claire continued, "you said he'd been researching marketing professionals for months. That's not something you do on a whim because you feel sorry for someone. That's something you do when you're serious about finding the right person for a job." I nodded, knowing she was right but still struggling with the voice in my head that insisted this was too good to be true. That voice sounded suspiciously like my mother's, I realized. How many opportunities had I talked myself out of over the years because I'd internalized the message that I wasn't quite good enough, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps came my way? "What are you going to tell your family?" Claire asked. The question I'd been avoiding since leaving the club. If I took this job, if I became not just an employee but a member of Riverside Country Club, it would fundamentally alter the power dynamic that had defined my relationships with my parents and siblings for my entire adult life. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to call my mother right now and tell her exactly what happened. But another part of me thinks I should just take the job and let them figure it out when they see my name on the club directory." Claire grinned. "I vote for option 2. Let them discover you're their new social superior the hard way." We talked until almost 2 in the morning, Claire helping me work through the practical aspects of the decision. The job would require me to relocate to Millbrook, which meant leaving Hartford and the life I'd built here. But it also meant financial independence, professional fulfillment, and most importantly, the chance to define myself on my own terms rather than in reaction to my family's expectations. By the time I finally went to bed, I knew what my answer would be. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in over a year. I needed time to think, to process, and to make some phone calls without my coworkers overhearing conversations about country club memberships and salary negotiations. I also needed to see William Harrison again, to make sure the evening hadn't been some kind of elaborate dream. He answered his direct line on the second ring, his voice warm and professional. "Emma, I was hoping to hear from you today. Have you had time to consider our conversation?" "I have," I said, pacing around my small living room. "And I'm interested. Very interested. But I have some questions." "Of course. Would you like to meet this morning? I could show you the office space you'd be working in, introduce you to some of the staff you'd be collaborating with." Within an hour, I was driving. Back to Millbrook, this time with a sense of purpose rather than dread. The country club looked different in the morning light, less intimidating and more like a place where actual work happened. William met me at the main entrance, dressed in a casual polo shirt and khakis that somehow still managed to look expensive. "Welcome back," he said with a smile. "Ready for the grand tour?" He led me through areas of the club I'd never seen before, past the dining rooms and social spaces into the administrative wing where the real business of running a country club happened. The marketing office was a corner room with windows overlooking the golf course, furnished with a desk that was probably older than I was but in perfect condition. "The previous marketing director retired last year," William explained. "She'd been with us for 15 years and did excellent work, but her approach was very traditional. We're looking for someone who can bring fresh perspectives while respecting our heritage." He introduced me to several staff members, from the events coordinator to the head of membership services. Each conversation reinforced my sense that this was a real opportunity, with real challenges and real potential for impact. "I'd like you to meet Margaret Chen," William said, as we approached a woman in her 40s reviewing spreadsheets at a desk covered with fabric samples and catering. "Menus. Maggie, this is Emma Thompson, the marketing professional I mentioned." Maggie looked up with genuine warmth, extending her hand with a firm grip. "Emma, William's been singing your praises. I've actually been following your work with the Hartford nonprofit coalition. That healthcare access campaign was brilliant." I felt a flush of pride at the recognition. In my current job, my successes often felt invisible, absorbed into larger company achievements without individual acknowledgement. Here, my work was not only known but appreciated. "Maggie handles our special events and community outreach," William explained. "She'd be one of your closest collaborators if you join us." "When you join us," Maggie corrected with a grin. "William doesn't usually give personal tours to candidates he's not serious about hiring." The confidence in her voice, the assumption that I would accept the position, felt like a gift I'd been waiting my whole life to receive. These people wanted me, not despite my background but because of my skills and potential. We spent the morning discussing specific projects and initiatives. The club was planning a major community partnership with local schools, developing scholarship programs for promising students whose families couldn't afford membership. They wanted to modernize their event offerings while maintaining the elegance that defined the club's reputation. There were social media strategies to develop, corporate partnerships to explore, and a complete rebranding initiative that would require creativity, sensitivity, and strategic thinking. "It's a big job," William said as we concluded the tour in his office. "Not without challenges. Some of our older members are resistant to change, and you'll need to navigate those relationships carefully." "Some of those older members being my own family," I said. William's expression grew serious. "Emma, I want to be direct about something. Your family's reaction to your employment here is their business to manage. Your job performance and professional responsibilities are between you and this club. I hope that distinction is clear." It was clear, and it was exactly what I needed to hear. For the first time in my adult life, I was being offered a position where my family relationships wouldn't define my professional opportunities or limitations. "I accept," I said, the words coming out more confidently than I'd expected. "When would you like me to start?" William's smile was immediate and genuine. "How does 2 weeks sound? That should give you time to provide appropriate notice at your current position and arrange for the relocation. We spent another hour discussing salary details, benefits packages, and the logistics of my membership privileges. As William had promised, the compensation was substantially better than my current job, but more than that, the respect being shown for my experience and potential felt revolutionary. "There's one more thing," William said as he walked me to the door. "The board meets monthly, and new key employees are traditionally introduced at their first meeting. That happens to be this coming Thursday evening." "Will my parents be there?" I asked, suddenly aware that the board likely included several families from my parents' social circle. "Your father isn't on the board, but some of his friends are. Patricia serves on the social committee, which reports to the board, so yes, she'll likely be present." The irony was almost too perfect. Less than a week after being banished to eat in the parking lot, I'd be standing before the club's governing body as their new marketing director and newest member. "Good," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "That's perfect timing." The drive back to Hartford was triumphant in a way I'd never experienced before. I called Claire from the car, putting her on speaker as I navigated the familiar route between my old life and my new one. "You took it!" she screamed, loud enough that I had to turn down the volume. "Emma, I'm so proud of you. This is going to change everything." She was right. This wasn't just a new job. It was a complete reimagining of my life's trajectory. For years, I'd been trying to prove my worth to people who were determined not to see it. Now I was stepping into a role where my worth was not only recognized, but actively sought out. That afternoon, I drafted my resignation letter to my current employer, giving them the full 2 weeks' notice despite their policy that allowed for less. I'd always tried to leave situations better than I'd found them, and this would be no exception. I also began the process of apartment hunting in Millbrook, something that would have been financially impossible just days earlier, but now felt like an exciting adventure. The irony of returning to my hometown as a successful professional rather than a struggling family disappointment wasn't lost on me. But the most important call I made was to my cousin Tyler, my father's nephew who'd always been the family truth-teller. Tyler lived in Boston now, pursuing a career in journalism, but he maintained relationships with the extended family, while somehow avoiding most of the drama that seemed to follow the rest of us. "Emma." Tyler's voice was warm with surprise. "How did the reunion go? I heard there was some kind of drama, but you know how family gossip gets distorted." "Actually, Tyler, I was hoping you could help me understand something. How much do you know about the club's board structure and committee? Appointments?" Tyler was quiet for a moment. "That's a very specific question. What's going on?" I gave him a careful overview of recent developments, leaving out some of the more personal details about my parking lot dinner, but including the job offer and its implications. "Holy shit! Emma," Tyler said when I finished. "Do you realize what you've just done? I took a job I'm qualified for with an organization that values my skills. You just became the most powerful Thompson in 3 generations. The social committee reports to the board, which means your mother is about to become your subordinate in the club hierarchy. And not just any subordinate. She's going to have to come to you for approval on event budgets and vendor relationships." The full magnitude of the power shift was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just about professional success or financial independence. This was about fundamentally altering relationships that had been fixed in place since childhood. "Tyler," I said carefully, "what do you think the family reaction is going to be?" His laugh was rueful. "Emma, I think you're about to find out exactly who your family really is. Some of them might surprise you in good ways, others—" He trailed off diplomatically. "Others might surprise me in ways I should be prepared for." "Exactly. But Emma, for what it's worth, I think this is the best thing that could have happened to you." You've been trying to earn their respect for years by shrinking yourself to fit into their expectations. Maybe it's time to see what happens when you stop shrinking. That evening, Claire and I celebrated with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine that cost more than we usually spent on groceries for a week. As we sat on our small balcony overlooking the Hartford skyline, I felt a sense of completion and beginning all at once. "You know what the best part of this is?" Claire said, raising her glass in a toast. "The salary? The professional opportunity? The chance to completely flip my family dynamic?" "All of that," she agreed. "But mostly, the fact that you're finally going to find out what you're capable of when people actually believe in you." As the sun set over the city I was preparing to leave behind, I realized that Claire was right. For the first time in my adult life, I was walking towards something I wanted rather than away from something that hurt me. The transformation wasn't complete yet, but it had begun, and there would be no going back. Thursday evening arrived with the crisp clarity that only September in Connecticut could deliver. I stood in my new apartment, a charming one-bedroom rental just 10 minutes from Riverside Country Club, adjusting the collar of my navy blazer for the third time. The apartment still smelled like fresh paint and possibility, boxes stacked neatly in the corner waiting to be unpacked. I'd moved in just 2 days earlier, my transition from Hartford tenant to Millbrook resident happening with startling efficiency. My reflection in the bedroom mirror showed a woman I was still getting used to. Same face, same hair, but something fundamental had shifted in the way I carried myself. The constant tension between my shoulder blades had disappeared. The defensive hunch I'd developed from years of trying to make myself smaller was gone. I looked like someone who belonged wherever she chose to be. The past week had been a whirlwind of paperwork, handshakes, and orientation meetings. My former colleagues in Hartford had been stunned by my resignation, several admitting they'd always thought I was overqualified for my position there. The transition had been smoother than expected, with my replacement eager to take over projects I'd been managing for months without adequate recognition or compensation. But tonight was different. Tonight was the official introduction to the Riverside Country Club Board of Directors, the formal announcement of my appointment as marketing director, and, most significantly, the moment my family would discover that the daughter they'd banished to eat in a parking lot was now their social and professional superior. Within the institution they revered above all else. I checked my watch. 6:30. The board meeting was scheduled for 7, with cocktails beforehand in the club's private library. William had suggested I arrive a few minutes early to meet some of the board members individually before the formal presentation. The strategy made sense professionally, but personally, it meant I'd have a few minutes to observe my family's reaction before the official proceedings began. The drive to the club felt surreal, like traveling through a looking glass into an alternate version of my life. A week ago, I'd driven this same route feeling like an imposter heading to my own humiliation. Tonight, I was driving to claim a position of authority and respect that I'd earned through talent and hard work, rather than family connections or inherited wealth. The club's parking lot was fuller than usual, luxury vehicles arranged in neat rows like expensive chess pieces. I found a spot near the entrance, noting with quiet satisfaction that I no longer felt the need to park in the far corner to avoid comparison with more expensive cars. My Honda Civic was what it was, and it had gotten me exactly where I needed to be. Thomas, the server who'd attended our dinner in the private dining room, greeted me at the entrance with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased rather than merely professional. "Good evening, Miss Thompson. Mr. Harrison is expecting you in the library." The library was a room I'd never been in before, all dark wood paneling and leather-bound books that looked like they'd been selected more for their aesthetic value than their literary merit. A small bar was set up in the corner, tended by a club employee who moved with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to serving people who expected perfection without having to ask for it. William approached immediately, his handshake firm and his smile reassuring. "Emma, you look perfect. Ready for this?" As ready as anyone can be for announcing their professional success to people who've spent years questioning their competence, I replied, surprised by my own honesty. William's laugh was appreciative. That's exactly the kind of directness we need around here. Too many people in this environment spend too much energy avoiding uncomfortable truths. He began introducing me to board members as they arrived, and I was pleasantly surprised by their warmth and genuine interest in my background and vision for the club's marketing initiatives. These were successful business owners, retired executives, and community leaders who asked thoughtful questions about demographics and digital strategies rather than probing into my family connections or social pedigree. Dr. Patricia Winters, who'd built a successful medical practice before retiring to focus on philanthropy, was particularly engaging. I've been advocating for months that we need someone with real marketing expertise, she said. The club has been operating on tradition and reputation for too long without actively cultivating our community relationships. James Caldwell, who'd made his fortune in manufacturing before becoming one of Connecticut's most prominent environmental advocates, nodded in agreement. William tells us you have experience with nonprofit partnerships. That's exactly what we need to expand our scholarship programs and community outreach. Their respect for my professional credentials felt revolutionary after years of family gatherings where my career was treated as an amusing hobby rather than a legitimate accomplishment. These people didn't care that I'd never married well or produced grandchildren. They cared about my ability to solve problems and generate results. By 6:50, most of the board had arrived, along with committee chairs and other club officials who attended monthly meetings. The social committee, which my mother chaired, was expected to present their quarterly report tonight, which meant she would be arriving any moment. William positioned himself near the library entrance, clearly planning to intercept my parents. When they arrived, I appreciated his strategy, but I'd decided I wanted to handle this revelation on my own terms. I excused myself from a conversation about social media analytics and moved to where I could observe the entrance while appearing to study the club's historical photographs on the far wall. My mother's voice reached me before I saw her, that particular tone of command she used when she wanted to ensure everyone understood her importance. She swept into the library wearing a cream-colored Chanel suit that probably cost more than my car, my father trailing behind in his best navy blazer and the tie I'd given him for Christmas 3 years ago. I watched from across the room as William approached them, his expression carefully neutral. I couldn't hear their conversation over the general murmur of pre-meeting socializing, but I could read my mother's body language like a familiar book. Polite attention shifted to confusion, then to something that looked like disbelief. My father's reaction was more subtle, but no less telling. His hand moved instinctively to adjust his tie, a nervous habit he'd had since I was a child. He glanced around the room as if looking for someone, and I realized he was looking for me. That was my cue. I set down my wine glass and walked across the room with measured steps, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Several board members greeted me as I passed, their warm acknowledgments clearly audible to my parents, who were still processing whatever William had just told them. "Mother, Dad," I said as I reached them, my voice level and professional. "What a pleasant surprise to see you here tonight." My mother's face had gone through several color changes in the past 30 seconds, settling on a pale shade that clashed with her carefully applied blush. "Emma? What are you doing here? William was just telling us some story about you working here, but that can't be right. You work in Hartford." "I worked in Hartford," I corrected gently. "As of Monday, I'm the new marketing director for Riverside Country Club. I'm here tonight for my formal introduction to the board." The silence that followed was the kind that seems to echo even in rooms full of people. My father cleared his throat twice before managing to speak. "Marketing director? Here? Emma, what in the world is going on?" William stepped smoothly into the conversation. "Richard, Patricia, I'm delighted to have Emma joining our team. Her credentials are impressive, and her vision for expanding our community partnerships aligns perfectly with the club's strategic goals." "But she's our daughter," my mother said, as if this fact somehow disqualified me from professional achievement. "Indeed she is," William replied. "You must be very proud of her accomplishments." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. My parents had spent years treating my career as a source of mild embarrassment, evidence that I'd failed to achieve the traditional markers of success they valued. Now they were being asked to publicly acknowledge pride in achievements they'd never bothered to understand or celebrate. "Of course we're proud," my father said automatically, though his confused expression suggested he wasn't entirely sure what he was supposed to be proud of. My mother's recovery was swifter and more strategic. Years of social navigation had taught her to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, at least in public. "Emma has always been so ambitious," she said with a smile that looked painted on. "We're thrilled that she's found such a wonderful opportunity." The word ambitious in my mother's vocabulary had always been faintly pejorative, code for unwomanly striving and misplaced priorities. Hearing her use it as a compliment felt like watching someone speak a foreign language they'd just learned. Dr. Winters approached our group, apparently unaware of the family drama unfolding. "Patricia, I was just telling Emma how excited we are about her ideas for the scholarship program. She has some innovative approaches to community partnerships that could really expand our reach." My mother's smile became more genuine as she processed the implications. Whatever her personal feelings about my career choices, having her daughter praised by one of the club's most respected board members was social currency she could spend. "Emma has always been creative," she said, this time with what sounded like actual warmth. "I'm sure she'll bring wonderful, fresh perspectives to the club." The transformation was remarkable to witness. Within minutes, my mother had shifted from confusion and resistance to active claiming of my success as a reflection of her own excellent parenting. It would have been amusing if it hadn't been so predictable. William announced that the formal meeting would begin in 5 minutes, and the group began moving toward the boardroom. As we walked, I found myself flanked by my parents, who had apparently decided that being seen with their newly important daughter was preferable to processing their complicated feelings about my elevation in private. The boardroom was everything I'd expected from an institution that prided itself on tradition and gravitas. A massive mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by leather chairs that had probably been occupied by the same families for generations. Oil paintings of club founders gazed down from the walls with expressions of stern approval. William called the meeting to order and began with routine business, financial reports, and membership updates that I half listened to while observing the group dynamics. These were people accustomed to power and comfortable with authority, but they were also people who understood the value of competence and results. When William reached my introduction on the agenda, he stood and gestured for me to join him at the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce our new marketing director, Emma Thompson. Emma comes to us with extensive experience in strategic marketing, nonprofit partnerships, and community outreach. Her vision for expanding our club's engagement with the broader Millbrook community aligns perfectly with our goals for sustainable growth and social responsibility." I stood and addressed the room with the same confidence I'd developed in client presentations, outlining my background and initial observations about opportunities for the club. I talked about digital marketing strategies, community partnership, potentials, and innovative approaches to member engagement that would honor tradition while embracing progress. The questions that followed were intelligent and engaged, covering everything from budget considerations to timeline expectations. These people were taking my expertise seriously, treating me as a professional rather than someone's daughter who'd stumbled into a position above her qualifications. When the formal introduction concluded, James Caldwell raised his hand. "I have a motion to formally welcome Emma Thompson to her position and to express our confidence in her leadership of the marketing initiatives we've discussed." The motion was seconded immediately and passed unanimously. a gesture of support that felt more meaningful than any family approval I'd ever received. As the meeting continued with other business, I noticed my mother watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't pride exactly, but it wasn't the usual disappointment either. It was something closer to reassessment, as if she were seeing me clearly for the first time in years. During a brief recess, she approached me near the windows overlooking the golf course. "Emma," she said quietly, "I had no idea you were considering a change like this. When did all of this happen?" "Recently," I said, not elaborating about the timeline or circumstances that had led to the opportunity. "But why didn't you tell us? We could have helped, made introductions, smoothed the way somehow." The irony was stunning. The woman who'd banished me to eat in a parking lot just days earlier was now suggesting she could have helped facilitate my professional advancement. "I managed fine on my own," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Sometimes it's better to earn opportunities, through merit rather than connections." My mother's face flushed slightly, and I wondered if she was remembering last Saturday's reunion and her role in the humiliation that had inadvertently led to this transformation. "Of course," she said. "I just meant that we're family, and families support each other." "They do," I agreed, "when they recognize each other's worth." The statement wasn't accusatory, but it wasn't neutral either. My mother was smart enough to understand the subtext, and for a moment, her carefully maintained composure slipped enough to show something that looked almost like regret. Before she could respond, William announced that the meeting would resume, and we returned to our seats. The remainder of the evening passed with routine club business, but I could feel the shift in how people interacted with me. Board members made a point of speaking with me after the meeting, several extending invitations to lunch or coffee to continue conversations about marketing initiatives. My parents lingered as the room emptied, clearly unsure how to navigate this new dynamic. My father approached with the hesitant manner of someone walking on unfamiliar ground. "Emma, congratulations," he said. "This is quite an achievement. The salary must be substantial." Trust my father to focus on the financial implications rather than the professional recognition. But his interest wasn't disapproving. It was calculating, as if he were reassessing my value in the family hierarchy based on this new information about my earning potential. "It's fair compensation for the position," I said diplomatically. "And you'll be living in Millbrook again? Perhaps we could have dinner sometime this week. Your mother would love to hear more about your plans for the club." The invitation was stilted and awkward, but it was also the first time in years that either parent had suggested spending time with me for reasons other than family obligation or crisis management. "I'd like that," I said, surprising myself by meaning it. As my parents left the boardroom, my mother paused at the door. "Emma, about last Saturday," she began, then seemed to think better of whatever she'd planned to say. "I'm glad things worked out well for you." It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement, and from my mother, that was more than I'd expected to receive. William waited until the room had cleared completely before approaching me with a smile that reached his eyes. Well, that went better than expected. Did it? I wasn't sure how to read some of those reactions. "Emma, you just commanded the respect of one of Connecticut's most influential boards within minutes of your introduction. Several of these people have asked me privately about scheduling meetings with you to discuss specific projects. That's not politeness. That's recognition of competence." As we walked toward the exit, I reflected on the evening's transformation. A week ago, I'd been the family disappointment eating leftovers in a parking lot. Tonight, I'd been unanimously welcomed into a position of authority and influence within the institution my family considered the pinnacle of social achievement. The girl who'd spent years trying to earn a place at tables where she wasn't wanted had finally stopped asking for permission and had simply taken the seat she deserved. And the most remarkable part wasn't the professional achievement or the financial independence or even the reversal of family dynamics. The most remarkable part was discovering that once I stopped trying to prove my worth to people who were determined not to see it, my actual worth became impossible to ignore. 6 months later, I stood in my office overlooking the 18th hole of Riverside Country Club's championship golf course, reviewing the quarterly membership report that would be presented to the board that afternoon. The numbers were impressive. Membership inquiries had increased by 47% since we'd launched the Community Partnership Initiative. Our scholarship program had expanded to include 12 local students, and the waiting list for our young professionals networking events extended well into the summer. But the statistics that mattered most weren't printed on any report. They were visible in the way staff members sought out my opinion on operational decisions, the way board members included me in strategic planning conversations, and perhaps most significantly, the way my own family had slowly but steadily recalibrated their understanding of who I was and what I was capable of achieving. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Those first few weeks after the board meeting had been a delicate dance of adjustment, with everyone involved trying to find their footing in the new dynamic. My mother had oscillated between pride in my success and confusion about how to incorporate this version of her daughter into her existing worldview. My father had approached our relationship with a business-like courtesy that was more respectful than anything we'd shared in years, though it lacked the warmth I'd always hoped for. My siblings had been perhaps the most interesting to observe. Jessica had initially reacted with something approaching jealousy, unable to reconcile her identity as the successful daughter with my sudden professional prominence. Michael had surprised me by expressing genuine interest in my work, asking thoughtful questions about marketing strategies and community development that suggested he saw me as a peer rather than his disappointing older sister. The dinner my parents had suggested after the board meeting had taken place 3 weeks later, in the club's main dining room where I now ate regularly as a member, rather than occasionally as a tolerated guest. The conversation had been stilted. Initially, my parents clearly unsure how to navigate a relationship where their daughter held social and professional authority within their most valued community institution. But as the months passed, something deeper had begun to shift. My mother had started calling me for advice on social committee initiatives, genuinely seeking my professional opinion rather than simply going through the motions of family consultation. She'd begun introducing me at club functions not as our daughter Emma, but as Emma Thompson, our marketing director, with a tone that suggested actual pride rather than resigned acknowledgement. My father had surprised me most of all. During our third monthly dinner, he'd asked about my apartment, my financial planning, my long-term career goals with the kind of paternal interest I'd stopped expecting years earlier. When I'd mentioned considering purchasing a small house in Millbrook's historic district, he'd offered to accompany me to viewings, not to provide financial assistance, but to offer the perspective of someone who'd lived in the community for decades. The house I'd eventually purchased was a charming colonial built in 1847, with original wide plank floors and a kitchen that overlooked a garden someone had tended with obvious love. It was the kind of house I'd dreamed of owning someday, but had never imagined I'd be able to afford in my hometown. The mortgage payments were well within my budget, and for the first time in my adult life, I was building equity rather than simply covering rent. Claire had visited for the housewarming party I'd thrown in March, marveling at the transformation not just in my living situation, but in my entire presence. "You look like someone who belongs in her own life," she'd said, an observation that struck me as profoundly accurate. I'd spent so many years feeling like a guest in my own existence, apologizing for taking up space and asking permission to pursue my dreams. Now I inhabited my life fully, making decisions based on my own values and priorities, rather than trying to anticipate what might earn approval from people who seemed determined to withhold it. The knock on my office door interrupted my reflection. Maggie Chen entered with her characteristic energy, carrying a stack of event proposals and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd just solved a complex problem. The Hartwell Foundation confirmed their participation in the autumn gala, she announced, settling into the chair across from my desk. "They're contributing $50,000 to the scholarship fund, and bringing a delegation of board members to the event. Emma, this partnership is going to establish us as a serious player in Connecticut philanthropic circles. The Autumn Gala had been my idea, a sophisticated fundraising event that would showcase the club's commitment to community development while providing networking opportunities for members and local business leaders. It was exactly the kind of initiative that honored the club's traditions while expanding its relevance and impact. "Have you confirmed the catering arrangements with the kitchen?" I asked, pulling up the event timeline on my computer. "And did the graphics team finalize the invitation design?" "All handled. The invitations go to print tomorrow, and Thomas confirmed that the menu tasting is scheduled for Friday afternoon. Dr. Winters wants to review the seating arrangements, and your mother asked if she could stop by this afternoon to discuss the centerpiece concepts." The collaboration with my mother on club events had evolved into one of the more unexpected developments of the past few months. Her eye for aesthetic detail and understanding of social dynamics complemented my strategic planning and marketing expertise in ways that benefited both the club and our slowly healing relationship. We'd discovered that we worked well together when the focus was on shared goals rather than personal grievances. "Tell her to come by around 3, I said. "We should have the final head count by then, and I want to review the auction catalog before the board meeting." As Maggie left to coordinate the afternoon's activities, I returned to the membership report, noting with satisfaction that the demographic data showed exactly the kind of expansion we'd hoped to achieve. The club was attracting younger families, local professionals, and community leaders who valued the institution's history while appreciating its evolving mission. We'd managed to grow membership without compromising the quality of service or the exclusivity that existing members valued. My phone rang, displaying William Harrison's extension. 6 months into my tenure, our working relationship had settled into the kind of mutual respect and easy collaboration that made complex projects feel manageable. "Emma, do you have a moment to review the board presentation?" William's voice carried the focused energy that characterized his approach to club leadership. "I want to make sure we're highlighting the right metrics and giving you appropriate credit for the membership growth we've achieved." "Of course. Should I come to your office, or would you prefer to meet in the conference room?" "Actually, why don't we meet in the library? I have some news I'd like to discuss privately before the board meeting." The library had become one of my favorite spaces in the club, the same room where I'd been introduced to board members on that transformative Thursday evening 6 months earlier. Now it felt like a familiar and welcoming environment, a place where important conversations happened and strategic decisions were made. William was waiting with 2 cups of coffee and a folder that suggested our conversation would involve more than routine board preparation. His expression was serious but not concerned, the look of someone who had significant news to share rather than problems to solve. "Emma, I've been in discussions with the board's executive committee about the club's long-term strategic planning," he began, settling into the leather chair across from where I'd taken my usual seat near the windows. "What? Your success in the marketing role has exceeded everyone's expectations, and we're seeing results that go well beyond what we'd hoped to achieve in the first year." I felt a flutter of uncertainty, wondering if this conversation was leading toward additional responsibilities or perhaps feedback about areas needing improvement. In my previous job, private meetings with senior leadership had usually meant criticism disguised as constructive guidance. "The board has asked me to discuss an opportunity with you," William continued, his tone becoming more formal. "As you know, I've been president of Riverside for 8 years, and I've been considering stepping back to focus more on my consulting practice and spend time with my grandchildren." The implication began to dawn on me, though it seemed too significant to be real. Leadership positions at institutions like Riverside Country Club were typically held by people with decades of membership history and extensive community connections, not relative newcomers who'd been employees for less than a year. "What? The executive committee has asked me to gauge your interest in being considered for the position of club president," William said, his words landing with the weight of complete transformation. It would mean a substantial increase in responsibility and compensation. But more importantly, it would position you to shape the future direction of an institution that's been central to this community for over a century. I sat in stunned silence for several moments, processing the magnitude of what he was suggesting. The presidency of Riverside Country Club wasn't just a job. It was a position of significant influence within Connecticut's social and business networks. It was the kind of role that opened doors, shaped policy, and commanded respect across multiple communities. William, I'm honored that the board would consider me for such a position, but I have to ask whether this is realistic. I've been here 6 months. Most of the members have known each other for decades. Don't they expect someone with deeper roots in the community? William's smile was knowing, the expression of someone who'd anticipated exactly this concern. Emma, in the 6 months you've been here, you've transformed our community engagement, expanded our membership base, and brought fresh energy to an institution that had begun to feel insular and dated. More importantly, you've demonstrated the kind of leadership and vision that the board believes will be essential for our continued success. He opened the folder and passed me a document that outlined the responsibilities and compensation structure of the presidential role. The salary was more than double what I was currently earning, but beyond the financial implications, the position would make me one of the youngest club presidents in Riverside's history, and certainly the first to have risen from staff to leadership within a single year. The board would like to announce the transition at the autumn gala, William continued. It would be a symbolic passing of leadership that honors tradition while embracing change. And Emma, it would make a statement about the club's values that would resonate far beyond our membership. As we discussed the details of the potential transition, I found myself thinking about the conversation that would need to happen with my family. The woman who'd been excluded from the family reunion table 6 months earlier was being offered the opportunity to lead the institution that her family considered the pinnacle of social achievement. The irony was so complete, it felt almost fictional. That afternoon's board meeting proceeded with the usual efficiency, financial reports and membership updates delivered with the attention to detail that characterized all club operations. When William reached the agenda item labeled Strategic Planning and Leadership Transition, I felt my pulse quicken despite my outward composure. Ladies and gentlemen, as we look toward the next phase of Riverside's development, the Executive Committee has been discussing leadership succession and long-term strategic vision, William began, his tone carrying the gravity appropriate for such announcements. After 8 successful years in the presidential role, I've decided to step back to allow fresh leadership to guide our continued growth and community engagement. The board members' attention sharpened, several exchanging glances that suggested rumors had been circulating about potential changes in leadership. The Executive Committee has unanimously recommended Emma Thompson for the position of club president, effective January 1st. Her vision, leadership, and demonstrable results in expanding our community impact make her the ideal candidate to lead Riverside into its 2nd century of service. The silence that followed was brief but significant, the kind of pause that occurs when people are processing unexpected but logical information. Dr. Winters was the first to speak, her voice carrying enthusiasm that seemed to energize the entire room. I can't think of anyone more qualified to lead this transition, she said. Emma's brought exactly the kind of strategic thinking and community focus we need to remain relevant and vital. James Caldwell nodded in agreement. The membership growth and community partnerships she's developed in 6 months have positioned us for sustainable success. I'm fully supportive of this recommendation. The discussion that followed was remarkably positive, board members expressing confidence in my abilities and excitement about the direction I would take the club. When William called for a formal vote, the decision was unanimous, a level of support that felt both validating and slightly overwhelming. As the meeting concluded and board members offered congratulations and expressions of support, I noticed my mother watching from her position at the social committee table. Her expression was complex, mixing pride with something that looked almost like amazement, as if she were witnessing something she'd never imagined possible. After the room had cleared of everyone except family members, my mother approached with uncharacteristic hesitation. My father stood slightly behind her, his expression suggesting he was still processing the implications of his daughter's elevation to club leadership. "Emma, congratulations," my mother said, her voice carrying a warmth I hadn't heard in years. "President of Riverside. I have to admit, I never imagined. That is, this is quite an achievement." For the first time in our adult relationship, my mother seemed genuinely uncertain about how to interact with me. The power dynamic that had defined our family relationships for decades had shifted so completely that we were all navigating unfamiliar territory. "Thank you," I said simply. "I hope I can live up to the board's confidence." My father stepped forward, extending his hand with formal courtesy that gradually warmed into something approaching paternal pride. "Emma, your mother and I owe you an apology. We didn't see what you were capable of, and we didn't support you the way we should have." The acknowledgement was more than I'd ever expected to receive, and certainly more than I'd dared to hope for. It wasn't a complete resolution of years of complicated family dynamics, but it was recognition, and from my parents, that felt revolutionary. "We're proud of you," my mother added, the words carrying weight precisely because they were so rarely spoken. Not just because of the position, but because of how you've earned it. You've shown grace and competence in circumstances where others might have been vindictive or small. As my parents left the boardroom, expressing hopes for a family dinner to celebrate the announcement, I remained alone in the space where my professional life had been transformed. The oil paintings of club founders gazed down from the walls, their stern expressions now seeming approving rather than judgmental. The autumn gala 3 weeks later was everything we'd envisioned and more. The club's main ballroom was transformed with seasonal decorations that honored tradition while suggesting innovation. Local business leaders, philanthropists, and community members mingled with club members in an atmosphere that felt both elegant and welcoming. My family attended as my guests, my parents clearly basking in reflected glory as other attendees congratulated them on their daughter's achievements. Jessica had brought her husband and seemed genuinely interested in the scholarship recipients we were honoring. Michael had driven down from Boston specifically for the event, telling anyone who would listen about his sister's innovative approaches to community engagement. But the moment that mattered most came near the end of the evening, when William Harrison stepped to the podium to announce the leadership transition. As he described my vision for Riverside's future and the board's confidence in my abilities, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with professional achievement and everything to do with personal transformation. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Riverside Country Club's new president, Emma Thompson," William said, gesturing for me to join him at the front of the room. As I stood before the assembled guests, many of whom had known me since childhood as the Thompson daughter who'd never quite fit the family mold, I realized that the journey from parking lot humiliation to club leadership wasn't really about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It was about discovering my own worth and refusing to accept anything less than what I deserved. The applause was warm and sustained, but what moved me most was seeing my parents in the front row, clapping with what looked like genuine pride and amazement. The woman they'd asked to eat in her car 6 months earlier was now being celebrated as a leader worthy of guiding one of Connecticut's most prestigious institutions. In my brief acceptance speech, I talked about tradition and innovation, about honoring the past while embracing the future. But privately, I was thinking about the girl who'd spent years trying to earn a seat at tables where she wasn't wanted, and the woman who'd finally stopped asking for permission and had simply created her own place of belonging. Sometimes the people who should lift you up are indeed the ones holding you down, but sometimes being pushed away from where you don't belong is exactly what you need to discover where you do. Sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another, better one. And sometimes the most powerful transformation happens, not when you prove your worth to people who refuse to see it, but when you finally stop needing their validation to know who you are. The journey from family disappointment to community leader had taught me that worth isn't something you earn from others. It's something you recognize in yourself and refuse to compromise. And once you stop settling for crumbs, you discover that the feast was always within your reach. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.